Both to the folks here in the room joining us in person back at Colorado Law School. I'm really excited to be seeing human bodies, as well as all of you across the country, across the world who are joining us virtually. My name is Amy Stepanovich. I'm the Executive Director of Silicon Flatirons, and we're excited to be hosting this year's Spectrum Policy Conference on Frontiers in Spectrum Sharing. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that wherever we are meeting on the lands of First Nations peoples, and the traditional owners of the land here in Boulder are the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. And I'd like to pay particular respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, who lead these communities. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce Keith Grembin to the stage and who will do a more formal introduction of today's conference. Before that, I want to say a thanks to the Silicon Flatirons and the law school staff who have made today's event possible for their hard work, getting everything up and running. We're kind of running two separate events today for the people in person and virtually. It's added a whole new component to what we do. And I hope that we are successful, but please do look for that feedback form after the event's over. Let us know what we can do better. Let us know what's worked. We love hearing back from you on what is great and how to better serve our community. In particular, I want to also thank our student volunteers, all of our students who are going to see in the room and over the live stream over the next couple days, and to the individuals and the organizations who support Silicon Flatirons and make these conversations and all of the work that we do possible day in and day out. That's why we can catalyze conversations and help to develop who we believe are going to be the next generation of professionals leading in the tech community. And I have one more really exciting announcement before I turn things over. Starting with this conference, I get to announce that Dr. Keith Grembin will be joining Silicon Flatirons as the new co-director of our Spectrum Policy Initiative alongside Dale Hatfield. I could not be more excited to welcome Keith. Dr. Grembin has long and illustrious resume, which I urge you to check out if you have not previously done so, including 30 years in the defense industry as a software architect and systems engineer, where he has led research and engineering efforts in robotics, command and control systems, and tactical communications. This, of course, means that Pierre DeVries will be stepping down, though he will be continuing on with the Silicon Flatirons family as a distinguished advisor and director emeritus, and we're excited also to continue to support his work as well. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Grembin to the stage, welcome you more formally to the Silicon Flatirons family, and allow you to introduce our first keynote. Thank you so much.
Logistics are a little more complicated nowadays. That's better. Thank you. Get the wave from the back. I thought I turned it on. So we apply the no acronym rule. So remember that audience and panelists may not be from your community. So a string of letters is not going to mean much to anybody. Make sure you define the acronym before you use it. So it's now my honor and privilege to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, Ambassador Grace Koh. As many of you know, Grace Koh was the former ambassador to the International Telecommunication Union's World Radio Communications Conference that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in 2019. In that role, she managed the interagency discussions to formulate the US policy positions and the strategies leading up to the conference. She then led the 125-member delegation in negotiating successful outcomes for both the US government and US private sector interests. So Grace came to the role as the ambassador very well prepared. She previously served as the special assistant to the president for technology, telecom, and cybersecurity policy in the White House, and was also the deputy chief counsel to the subcommittee on communication and technology of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the US House of Representatives. You can find additional information on Ambassador Koh's background in the program. What's interesting now is her current role as Vice President of Legislative Affairs at Nokia. Not only does she have to deal with terrestrial and satellite spectrum management issues, which we'll be discussing today, but potential interference and spectrum management sharing issues in space. And this is because the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, or NASA, see, no acronym rule, selected Nokia as a partner for building the first ever 4G LTE communication system in space. And that will help pave the way for long-term human presence on the moon. So let's welcome Ambassador Ko. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, Dr. Brembin. It's great to see Silicon Flatirons continuing to have such great leadership. I'm sure that they're really excited to have you, and it'll be great to see you leading our discussions in the future. And thanks very much for the kind intro. Really glad to be here with you all today on the 42nd day of May 2020. Like most of you, I'm pretty sure I've lost track of time in reality during this awful pandemic, and it's just been a hard slog trying to keep moving forward. But I'm glad to see that you all here at Silicon Flatiron you're still moving forward. You're still bringing together discussions, thoughtful perspectives, fresh ideas, getting a debate going, and new lines of research. I really do miss this real face-to-face dialogue during this period of social distancing. And I miss more the after session beer that you get to have with the panelists. But we're all moving forward. We're all trying to move forward. It's not actually May 2020. We're already actually in the fourth quarter of 2021. And I think looking around, so I thought I'd talk less about specifically about the spectrum sharing and less about maybe what Nokia is doing on the moon. Although I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But I just thought I'd talk a little bit about macro changes in the past few years and how views on globalization have changed and the rise of populism and activism, and ultimately how that's further accelerated by the pandemic. And then I was going to talk a little bit about how it impacts the world we inhabit on spectrum innovation in technology and what it means for spectrum sharing. It seemed better suited to my wheelhouse, as I'm not really an engineer, and I don't even play one on TV. So let's say that we go through cycles of populism every so often. My friend Bruce Mailman estimates that every 60 odd years, a wave of populism and then subsequent reforms sort of recurs throughout the American history. And you see it in the civil unrest of the 1960s. It happened during the end of the Gilded Age with the calls to end the gold standard in the late 1890s into the early 20th century. And you might even argue that the American Revolution could be considered the first American populist movement. And these past few years have definitely borne witness to some of the most shockingly clear articulations of populism: the election and departure of President Trump, the pro-Brexit vote, the Yellow Vest demonstrations in France, or just think about any country in South America in 2017 or 2019. And much of this populist sentiment appears to be due to globalization shocks. In short, it feels like the world is experiencing a giant sort of collective hangover from global policies that have been supporting globalization. So globalization, the notion of free movement of goods, labor, tech across borders under liberal agreements really took off, I guess, in the 1990s when we saw the end of the Cold War, the economic liberalization of India and China, as well as former Soviet satellites. We saw the creation of big multilateral institutions like the WTO and the EU. And don't forget that this is when the internet was born and our ability to communicate across borders accelerated and expanded exponentially. So globalization has had a lot of positive effects. Generally speaking, we saw at first what we expected to see: a massive increase in the global middle class and fewer people living below the poverty line. And just so you know, folks at the White House used to call me globalist Grace, and not in a friendly way. I'm not trying to defend or criticize any of the trends. I'm just trying to give you my interpretation of events at this point. The upshot was, though, that we came to realize that globalization didn't make everyone a winner. For example, during this time, the 1980s on and 1990s on, the gap between the rich and the poor really started to increase. Experts argue about whether globalization really contributed to income inequality, but the fact remains that the gap increased during the heyday of globalist policies. CBO estimates that from 1979 to 2018, income per household grew about 33% for the lower 80% of Americans. But for the top 20%, income grew 99%. For the top 1%, it was 218%. Other trends probably fueled the perception of being left behind in globalization. So rising trade pressure resulting from increased free trade, the financial crises like the one that the US and most of the world experienced in 2008, 2009, or the fiscal austerity that's related to foreign debt exposure in many other countries. Labor competition from increased immigration, which is perceived or otherwise. These have all contributed to a sense of economic insecurity that perhaps has fed populism and activism, not just here, but also across the globe. So let's also remember that the work that we do as technologists, engineers, and scientists have also contributed to this period of anxiety. Faster real-time communications, increased automation, greater computing power have all contributed to the efficiency gains that have also increased the pressure on the middle-class livelihood. The gig economy and part-time work accelerated with the advent of the app economy. This all came through at the same time. Deunionization and scarcity of the traditional pension-backed, benefits-laden full-time jobs came with those developments. And these are all, again, factors contributing to that sense of economic security that has now fed a populist and protectionist backlash that is increasingly in the mainstream. And if globalization shocks and technological advancements were already pushing us toward a protectionist populist agenda, I'd argue that the pandemic sealed the deal. The shutdown of borders gave the world a flash cut to a disconnected international economy and exposed vulnerable supply chains in all areas. People realized that the globalized world built for highly leveraged efficiency was ill prepared to take on a crisis of this kind. And after all, resiliency and preparedness are ultimately at odds with efficiency. A backup communications band is just spectrum lying fallow, right? As one general explained to me, I don't ever want to have to use it, but I sure as hell don't want to be without it in case shit goes south. Can you believe that? I haven't mentioned China really explicitly yet, and that's primarily because in one way, the anti-China sentiment is just shorthand for the anti-globalist view. China's rise coincides with the world's push toward globalization. China's accession to the WTO during the heyday of globalization had many experts claiming that China would become a liberal economy by 2015, maybe even a democracy. I think we know better now. American businesses and governments have, and liberal governments have faced a reality of continued trade deficits, state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfers, and the steadfast refusal to open the market to foreign enterprise. We saw a stronger, more aggressive China take advantage of enforcement-free agreements to expand and grow. And it's true, it is important to realize that China has emerged as a major rival to the United States, but I also still think it's useful to remember that this is about the reality of globalization. After all, globalization was fine when it really meant Americanization, as many people outside of the United States have pointed out. We might have a harder time with the concept of globalization if it actually means sinification. And it's been interesting to see that policymakers at this point are not interested in changing China, but coexisting with China. The end game appears to be defensive and more containment oriented, to pull a Cold War term. When I ask experts what our goals should be vis-a-vis China, one person who works at the New America Foundation or Institute said, America has to get used to living with a powerful China. Another person, actually a US Senator, actually said that, he said to me, we need to prevent China from winning. That's a very different sentiment from saying that the US needs to win or that we will ultimately persuade China to become a liberal democracy and a market economy. And if this is all true, that countries need to turn inward and focus on resilience and preparedness in order to be able to continue to fight off, I think, with perceived threats, from climate, from exposed supply chains, from pandemics, from adversarial threats. Countries need to figure out what actions policymakers should take. And we're seeing in the States that both parties are realigning around a populist agenda. Leaders on both sides of the aisle are preaching we need to regulate big tech, big banks, big companies generally, that we need to buy American, that we need to control our borders, and that we need to invest in domestic industry and domestic technology. That is sort of what this is coming to. Policymakers are looking to the role of technology in global leadership, and government wants in. Government wants a bigger role in technology and innovation. By the way, I fully realize the incongruity of saying this, even though we still haven't seen the nominations for an FCC chair or NTIA administrator. Just saying. But government wants a role in tech, and not just the tech and innovation that's used typically by the government for the military or for scientific research, but in the technology that's used in the commercial world. I think what we're worried about to some degree is tech imperialism, the notion that a country can spread its influence through its dominance in commercial technology. Maybe in the way that America has been able to be a significant leader in that respect for the past several years. And in spectrum, tech imperialism particularly matters. You might have to come up with a better term than that, but no matter how hard any country turns inward, spectrum floats across borders, and international cooperation is always going to be necessary. And without the cross-country dialogue, we risk interference at the borders, and we risk losing economic opportunity. How many F-16s or wireless routers can we sell if the rest of the world doesn't agree with our frequency allocations? This is just another example of how commercial tech is being co-opted into the realm of national security. The government is continuing to make inroads into how it would like to, I think, oversee, monitor, influence big tech or tech generally. You're seeing calls for increased antitrust scrutiny or efforts to look deeper into supply chains, efforts to collaborate more closely with the private and public sectors, like new mechanisms for monitoring progress, like the Cybersecurity Safety Board established in the recent Cybersecurity EO, or greater review of research facilities and who's actually staffing them, more explicit guidance on permissible and impermissible components and equipment, and just plain greater information sharing or spying. On the plus side, there's the government checkbook. The U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, still in draft at the House after its passage by the Senate, captures, I think, very well the U.S. desire to secure technology leadership in industry here. So much so, it runs, I think, to the tune of $200 billion. The bill focuses on the so-called strategic sectors: semiconductors, drones, wireless broadband, and artificial intelligence. And it seeks to do everything from educating a tech-forward workforce to creating funds to counter Chinese investment in other countries. But I did want to point out the word spectrum appears twice in this nearly 1,450 page bill. And one of the times it's really to talk about the full spectrum of issues. So I think that one doesn't count. It's a little troubling. And while the United States generally has never conducted explicit industrial policy, it's no longer completely unthinkable. It is the time for big changes. After the 50s and 60s came the Civil Rights Act, and after the unrest at the end of the Gilded Age came the Progressive Era and the glory days of labor unions and active antitrust enforcement. And if the US goes into industrial policy, we'll see the rest of the world do even more of it. But then again, you all work in spectrum, and very possibly spectrum policy has been one area where the US has come closest to ever having an industrial policy, despite its absence in the Senate draft. We all know the mantra, right? Spectrum is a scarce public resource, and the government has a compelling interest in ensuring its highest and best use. Highest and best use. Well, here's a secret I think you all know. There is no highest and best use. Well, not at the level that you all work at. GPS is just as important as weather forecasting, is just as important as missile radars, is just as important as mobile communications, is just as important as research into the Big Bang. New and innovative services are absolutely necessary for growth, but incumbent services are also absolutely necessary for stability. And each of these priorities are important to a functioning society. Sure, sometimes we shift them, but there's never going to be a point where the choices are easy or that we're able to be really, we'll choose a winner or a loser. Today, it seems that policymakers will seek efforts that will move the US towards self-sufficiency and preparedness, and there is very little margin. Against that policy backdrop, it becomes much harder to repurpose federal spectrum for commercial use. Plus, we've made all of the easy decisions on spectrum already in that instance. Although I think David Ruddle and Larry Strickland would not say that AWS3 was easy. Sorry. This is why essentially the Spectrum Memorandum in 2018 requires the NTIA to develop a sustainable strategy for spectrum usage with a particular emphasis on advancing spectrum efficiency sharing. At least that was the goal when I first started working on it in 2017. The point of the memorandum was to take the focus off repurposing spectrum from federal bands and move the ball on advancing sharing technologies. It was a recognition that more spectrum was not likely to come. Instead, I really wanted us to think differently about solving the problem. What is our desired end state? Ultimately, we should be able to take out that device, phone, radar, automobile, tiny little moisture sensor by the soybean plant, and have it connect to whatever spectrum is available and work flawlessly. Okay, so that is a pipe dream, but this is the time for big ideas. It's just as important now as it was in 2017 to set us on the path for determining how to make spectrum as abundant as possible. And the memo was intended to turn us toward plussing up our research into new spectrum sharing technologies, whether it's sensing, informing, coordinated sharing. We wanted to know how coordination could be improved, information could be better exchanged, maybe with a little less melodrama, among other things. Examining older technologies used by the government or the commercial sector and how they can be phased out and the spectrum could be refarmed. And of course, by us, I meant really NTIA. So sorry, all of you from NTIA who are here. You did have a ton of work. I would have tried to get you longer than 9 months to write up a national spectrum strategy though, but sorry, I left government. It would have been ideal to have NTIA lead a process to develop a strategy to increase the efficiency of spectrum usage and allocation for all of American society, not just government. Ideally, I would have liked to have seen a strategy outlining several work streams, including review of governmental uses, understanding what technologies might be primed for upgrades out into different technologies, cooperative review maybe with the FCC of underutilized bands, even in the commercial area, and possibilities for phase out and refarming spectrum there, review of redundancy in government services, possible technologies and candidate bands for sharing in both federal and commercial bands, and which spectrum sharing technologies might be good protocol to implement. Maybe also policy and technology measures to help coordinating those spectrum allocations instead. So listing all of that, I'm sure NTIA is really glad that somebody else finished the memo instead. I would have liked to have seen a review of engineering efforts, for example, to make transmission more efficient, or a plan to make plan to review engineering efforts. But with the cooperation of folks like you here at Silicon Flatirons, or academic fora or standards groups, I would have hoped to see a section maybe on cognitive radio and how it may help satellite systems use spectrum more efficiently. I would have liked to see a reprisal maybe of the receiver standard question in this document. I know that the industry appeared to just sort of heave this giant collective shudder when the question was asked the last time around back in 2012. But I am kind of glad to see Commissioner Symington bringing the issue back to the surface in such a thoughtful and deliberative way. It's a question worth exploring, particularly as the margins get tighter. And like I've been saying, it's time for big ideas. And speaking about big ideas, maybe it's time to revisit harm thresholds. What do our product cycles look like now? I mean, with NGSOs and shorter life cycles for satellite hardware, do we think we can implement evolving harm thresholds to get more use? I might have also imagined that the memo would have included a review of possible improvements to spectrum access systems for tiered access bands like the CBRS band. I have to toot Nokia's horn a little. I think it's obligatory. Nokia has done a great deal of work in developing the radios and sharing architecture for use of the 3.5 band. And using this architecture, I think you're seeing some budding success with the deployment of deployment of networks in multiple environments, like airports and oil fields and congestion zones. We can probably think of ways to improve SAS and different sort of modes in which we can implement the sort of shared information. So looking, for example, at the new incumbent informing capability system for 3.45, 3.55. It allows for submitted information, which probably takes sort of the the sensing capability question out of it, but coordination with any system and always introduces a kludge factor. And I would have loved to have seen NTI talk a little bit about the kludge factor and figure out how to automate processes. Maybe even talk about maybe how to use AI in determining and possibly predicting patterns of use. Everyone likes to bring up AI, I suppose. I did mention AI and spectrum sharing to the House of Representatives staff on the Science Committee as they were drafting their upcoming NIST reauthorization. So just so you know who to blame if that does come up again. I would have liked to have seen suggestions generally for increased collaboration between the developers of different services. This is something that like Marcus and I have talked about it in looking at the spectrum above 95 gigahertz. I sort of have to mention 6G in that instance, and I know some of you are throwing up a little bit in your mouths, but as researchers are beginning to work on this next generation of commercial mobile communications, it seems to be the perfect time to understand the characteristics of the services that coexist within the same radio frequency and actually try to design for coexistence. That's one of the good things coming out of this current discussion on radio altimeters in the C-band, at least in my opinion. RTCA has reached out to understand better what 5G characteristics are so they can take those characteristics into consideration as they draft the next standards for the next generation of radio altimeters. And certainly the government's convening power could help produce that dialogue. So I'm not really sure what the national spectrum strategy will hold, actually, but with the amount of attention paid to the last rather spectacular spectrum battles, I suspect that sharing methods will be top of mind. And I hope there are big ideas in this strategy to shake up the world a bit and meet the challenges posed by times of crisis. In the end, though, I think the single most important thing to bring back to the spectrum allocation process is trust, however. Without information exchange between the potentially coexisting services, sharing becomes impossible. And without sharing, it will be impossible to meet the challenges of the day. It is hard for one agency to make a call and determine what's going to happen for all of these incredibly important equities. What really does need to happen is for people to actually, without, I think, drama and fanfare, have the conversation of what is actually needed and what might be accomplished together. And that chaos of conversation could yield to really, really good spectrum usage improvements in sharing. And that is ultimately, I think, one of the things that hopefully the government will turn its attention to in trying to figure out how to produce that kind of environment. I would highly recommend that they do this maybe over a beer. So thanks for listening to me. Thanks for listening to my whole survey of thoughts over some of the developments of the times in the past few years and how that I think that it might impact the work that you all do. I appreciate your time.
I think we've got time for one question, and I had my microphone off earlier when I said we follow the Phil Weiser rule where the student gets to ask the first question. And our student is Jonathan Stokely. So if you'd come up to the podium.
Thank you, Ambassador. It was very insightful to hear your words. And I'm usually not one to be without a question, so I kind of had to struggle. So I want to keep it, I guess, fairly straightforward as much as possible. But what advice could you give to a second-year Master's of Business Administration student, MBA for short, and as they launch in their second half of their career and helping to both shape commercialization, but then as well as leverage spectrum to help narrow that the poverty gap and help trying to make a more equitable world so we can all grow forth and prosper as a global economy?
Wow, that's a good question. Thanks, Jonathan. I think one of the harder things to do actually has been, one of the more appealing things about shared spectrum generally is that the cost is not going to be nearly as much, right? You're not going to have to invest billions of dollars in licenses. I think, this turn towards shared may mean that spectrum becomes a little more accessible to entrepreneurs and folks who can find ways to make equipment that is actually going to be a little cheaper. A little cheaper means that it can be more widely deployed and used by people of different incomes, whether it is, a user consumer device or if it's a device that is that's an IoT sensor that helps to grow crops that allow people to eat because the farming is more efficient, or if it's a device that allows them to conduct payments, right, to keep their money safely as opposed to anywhere else. So I think there are all sorts of areas where you can go into this, I think a way. Use spectrum in a way that actually improves the lives of the general population. It will obviously be your choice, but it's great that you're thinking about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that's all the time we've got for questions. We're going to have to move on to our next panel, but thank you very much. We appreciate your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable having you. So next, our first panel addresses spectrum sharing in space. The moderator for this panel is Scott Palow. Scott is a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder and the associate director of Spectrum X. You can find a full biography of Scott on the conference webpage. So Scott, over to you and your panel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Keith. Just want to make sure we can hear okay, get a tech check.